This morning, my message is coming from Matthew chapter 1. So if you'd like to turn there with me. And while you're making your way to Matthew, over 30 years ago, my brother, who is here today, we were on a family vacation in Pennsylvania where our ancestors came from. And my father took us up to central Pennsylvania to a cemetery. It's a very small cemetery. No one is buried there presently. I mean, people are not being buried there on a regular basis, but our ancestors were buried there. It's the Henderson Cemetery in Center County, Pennsylvania. As a kid, it was just a place to go. I didn't really have a whole lot of interest in my ancestors at that time, but my father wanted to know who was keeping the place up, because it was mowed, it was manicured, and so he left a note, put it in a plastic bag, and attached it to one of the headstones in the cemetery. And it was found, it was discovered, and it made it into the press. The AP picked it up. It was published nationally in newspapers around the country, and it generated response. And I became very interested in my family lineage as a result of that, and talking to my grandmother before she passed away. I wanted to know about my family background. And when I was younger, I actually went up to Center County, Pennsylvania, went to the library there back in the early 90s. And there's archive library that they have there in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. And I began to go through those archives with the help of a librarian. And I found some old wills, a census, and I began to put this information together to create the family tree, so I could know my ancestors, where I came from as a Henderson. And it was very important to me to know that. How many of you are interested in your family lineage? You've put some research into it. You've looked into it. You know something about it. Yes, some of you have. It's of interest to me because it gives me a sense of grounding. Where did I come from? What is this Henderson name that has been passed down to me? Who are these ancestors? Did they do anything great? Well, so far, no. In my family background, most of them were farmers and laborers. They worked rough jobs, cutting down trees in central Pennsylvania. And a number of years ago, I even did the family DNA thing. They sent me a packet in the mail, and I did the swab inside my mouth. I put it into a container, send it off. And then over the past few years, I've been getting emails from people who had also done that and who have a connection to me. And I've been communicating with these folks. These are Hendersons that I don't know, but they come from the same family tree, the lineage that I do. And recently I've been talking to a guy named John Henderson. He lives in West Virginia. And we've been exchanging information. He descends from another brother who I descend from. In other words, there's two brothers, John and James Henderson, whose headstones are in the cemetery in Pennsylvania. He descends from James, and I descend from John. And his plan, what he'd like for us to do is meet up there, maybe in the spring. And he wants me to bring my dad with me, and he wants to bring his son, he's an older man too, and get a photograph made of the four of us, father and son, standing behind James and John's headstones. I suspect that might make national headlines again. I don't know, but it's such a neat thing, to make these connections. I don't know John personally. We've never met. We've just been emailing one another. He did send me a picture of himself, but it's just an exciting thing to learn about your lineage. Now, as you know, when you read the Bible, you come across lists of genealogies. And if you're like me, you have a tendency to just skip over that. But yet, at the same time, it's in the Bible, so it must be important, right? In fact, it was important to people who lived back then. It was extremely important. It was valuable for them to know their lineage, to know their backgrounds. And that served for a number of purposes. Did you know that knowing your lineage could have an impact on your tax status? If you could go back 7 generations, that could have an impact on how much taxes you would pay in certain countries in the ancient world. And so knowing your lineage was important. And there were people who were in charge of in taking care of that, keeping those records together. After AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, a lot of those genealogies were lost as a result of that. But when we come to the story of Jesus, and this is the Christmas time of the year where we celebrate, the first part of the story in both Matthew and Luke start off with genealogies of Jesus. You ever notice that? It's interesting we don't read them when we have Christmas plays, but they're there, so they must be important. But if you take a look at Matthew's genealogy and Luke's, you'll see that they're different. You ever notice that? They're different. In fact, they're different in a number of ways, but let me just point out a couple of those differences to you. When we read Luke, which is Luke's gospel is the one we most often read for the Christmas story, Luke lists 76 names in the genealogy leading up to Christ. They're all men. They're all men. You go to Matthew's genealogy, and he lists, I believe, 44 names. 4 of the 44 are women. I think that is interesting. It's significant because it wasn't usual, it wasn't typical for a genealogy to have the names of women in them. And if one ever did, it was because these women were highly, highly significant. But what I want to point out to you this morning is that when we read Matthew's genealogy, by the way, have you ever heard a sermon on the genealogy before? Or you're getting one this morning. If you look at the list of the women's names in Matthew's genealogy, they're not the kind of women that you would typically put into a genealogy, at least if you lived back then. So let's read it together, and then we're going to go through it and highlight some interesting facts about Matthew's genealogy. Let me get my glasses on, and we'll do that. This is Matthew chapter 1. The historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Tamar is a woman's name. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nachshon. And Nachshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, another woman's name. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, another woman. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. Then David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, but he doesn't say Bathsheba. He says Uriah's wife. There's a reason for that. We'll get to it. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Abijah fathered Asa, or some translations say Asaph. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Joram. Joram fathered Uzziah. And by the way, this is why we don't like to read these. Where was I? Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh fathered Ammon, sometimes translated Amos. Ammon fathered Josiah. Josiah fathered Jeconiah, I'm saying that right, and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. Notice how he's putting this into sections, sections of 14. Then after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah fathered Salathiel. Salathiel fathered Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel fathered Abiad. And Abiad fathered Eliakim. Eliakim fathered Azor. Azor fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Achim. Achim fathered Elihud. Elihud fathered Eleazar. Eleazar fathered Matthan. Matthan fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14, and from David until the exile to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah, 14 generations. Notice how Matthew divides it up into 4 groups of 14. Okay? Now, here's the interesting thing. We can go back and look in the Old Testament at genealogies, and what we discover is Matthew leaves people out. He doesn't have everybody in there. And so when you see the word father, it doesn't always mean direct father, son. It could mean grandfather or great-grandfather. This was quite common. It's a summary. It's a shorthand version of a probably much longer genealogy than the one that was given. So keep in mind, genealogies are important for establishing things. Matthew has a particular thing he wants to establish through his gospel. Remember, gospels, especially the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were biographies. They're considered to fall into the category of ancient biographies. A biography was generally written to give a portrait of someone. And as you know, portraits are like pictures. They're denoting something about this person that the author wants to emphasize. So the question is, what is Matthew wanting to emphasize about Jesus in his portrait? From the scripture reading, we read from the Matthew and Luke, the 2 Gospels, and these are the only Gospels that give us the Christmas account. We read from the conclusion of those Gospels. Sometimes we can get a sense of what's going on by reading the conclusion. My wife, Kathy, loves to read. She reads lots of novels. Her twin sister, Kay, likes to read not lots of novels, but they tend to read novels differently. They both start off pretty good. They start off at the beginning and begin to read the opening chapters. But unlike Kathy, her sister Kay, she has a tendency to skip to the end of the book to find out what's actually going to happen at the end. Drives Kathy crazy, because it's what they call that, a spoiler, right? She completely ruins it. But sometimes going to the end of the story helps us to understand what's really going on. And that's why I had you read from the 2 Great Commission passages in Matthew and Luke this morning. Because if you go to those passages, and in Matthew's gospel, that's the one we're really interested in this morning, what does Jesus say at the end of the gospel? What does Matthew put in there for us about Jesus to give us a clue about what Jesus' mission is, the mission that he wants to emphasize? It's a mission that he's emphasizing throughout his gospel. He starts off with it and he ends with it. But if we go to the end, we can see a much clearer picture of it. So what does he say in that? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay? If we go to the beginning of Matthew's gospel, what do we see? This is the historical record of Jesus Christ. And he lists two things to qualify this. 2 things he wants to focus on. Son of David, son of Abraham. Okay? Those are the 2 focuses that he has there. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay? This is the book, book of record, the Genesis of record. And this is what would be recalled to a first century reader of Matthew. It would remind them of Genesis, the genealogies of Genesis, you see. And what's interesting is there's a contrast here. When you read the genealogies in the Old Testament, it's a list of descendants of people. The descendants of Abraham, the descendants of Adam, and so on. But when we come to Matthew and Luke's genealogy, it's not the descendants, it's the ancestors. See, it's a difference. It's a significant difference. Because here we see the connection is being made to people in the past and their genealogies have significance because they're both attached to either being the son of David or the son of Abraham. Okay, so what do these designations mean? Son of David, what's the significance of that? It's significant in the sense that Matthew wants to establish why Jesus can claim that all authority has been given to him in heaven and on earth. And it's based upon Jesus being a descendant of the royal line of David. Now, in the ancient world, being in the royal line does not necessarily mean that you're in the biological line. There's a difference. But being the royal line is good enough. It's sufficient for establishing what Matthew wants to establish. And so he wants his readers to see that Jesus belongs in the category of being a son of David. That puts him in the royal line. And we know that Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, was a descendant of David. We know it from the birth narrative, because where does he have to go when he has to go back to his hometown? He has to go back to Bethlehem, the city of David. Now, Bethlehem was a very small town. It wasn't really a city at all. It was a village. And Jerusalem, as we know, was called the city of David. But the people who lived in Bethlehem liked to call their little village the city of David. They were proud about that, you see, because they knew that David's family hailed from their village. So being a son of David puts him in the royal line of David. And this has all kinds of ramifications based upon Old Testament prophecy. Because the Old Testament prophet, the Davidic covenant, says that there's going to be a descendant from David who will be a king whose kingdom will last forever. He'll have a throne forever and a kingdom that will last forever, and he'll rule from that. So Matthew wants to establish that through the genealogy that he gives. But he also wants his readers to understand that Jesus is a descendant of Abraham as well. This is another important thing to keep in mind, because Abraham's descendants are Israelites. To be a true Israelite, you need to be a descendant of Abraham. And so not only is in Matthew's genealogy is Jesus in the royal line of a descendant of David, but he's also a true Israelite. In fact, he is Israel in a sense as well, because throughout Matthew's gospel, he makes sure that he explains Jesus' life, ministry, and teachings in the context of Israel's history. Everything Jesus does in the gospel is intentionally put into a context of Jesus living the life of Israel. Jesus is reliving Israel's past. The places that he goes, the things that he does, are all connected to the Old Testament story of Israel. When he is out on the boat during the storm and he calms the storm, that takes us back to the Old Testament. The story of Jonah, which we just got done going through, has that the Lord calms the storm. Going back to Genesis, it is the Spirit of God hovering over the chaos of the sea. And so all these connections are being made. Remember, after he calms the storm, what do the disciples say? What manner of man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Taking you back to the kind of man that he is. He's the Son of God. This is the kind of man that he is. He is of a divine nature, you see, because only God can control the wind and the waves in the storm. And so he's reliving the story of Israel. The places that he goes to Caesarea Philippi. Moses went there in the Old Testament. And he goes up, I believe, to Mount Hermon for the Transfiguration. I mean, there's so many of these places that he travels to, so many things that he does, and he alludes to things constantly from the story of God's people of Israel. He is the true Israelite. He accomplishes what Israel failed to accomplish, what God intended them to accomplish. He brings it to fruition. And so this is what Matthew wants his readers to see in this genealogy. And this is why he sets it up the way he does. But let's talk about these women for a moment. He mentions 4 women. And who are these women? Well, the first of these women is a woman by the name of Tamar. Okay, you know anything about Tamar? If you don't, go back to Genesis 38 and read her story. What's significant about all these women is that they're not really Jews. They're not Israelites. Bathsheba may have been, but we don't know for sure. She had a connection, though, to Gentiles. Tamar was a Canaanite. Okay? Rahab was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabite. Okay? Bathsheba was married to a Hittite. I'll tell you why I think Matthew doesn't name Bathsheba and says the wife of the Hittite. He doesn't like her. Why doesn't he like her? Well, if you know the story, you can understand why he doesn't. But let me go back to Tamar for a moment and just give you the gist of her story. Tamar was married to the eldest son of a family. He dies. And according to the Levirate practice at the time, the Levirate marital practice, to preserve the lineage of her husband and the inheritance and all that, the next brother needed to marry her. He does. He dies. There's still one brother left, but he's too young to get married. And so the father promises that, the father's name is Judah, he promises that when he's old enough, he'll be married to her. Now remember, they often had more than one wife back then, so this doesn't spoil anybody else's inheritance, but it's just to guarantee that the brother who's died, that his inheritance and his lineage would be preserved. The father does not keep the promise. He doesn't ensure that she marries the youngest son. So what does she do? She puts together a scheme. And she puts a veil over her face. She actually dresses like a prostitute, puts a veil over her face, and waits along the roadway where she knows her father-in-law is traveling. And when he comes along, he says, I want to go in with you. Okay, he wants to take advantage of the prostitute. He doesn't know it's Tamar. But he goes in with her, and then he leaves. But he promises to pay her the fee, which is a goat. They agree upon a goat. That will be the fee. Okay? And she says, I want collateral. I want a guarantee. He gives her his staff and his signet ring until the goat payment is made. So he leaves. She gets pregnant. Okay? But before that happens, he wants to send the payment, but they can't find the prostitute anywhere along the road. She gets pregnant. He finds out that his former daughter-in-law is pregnant. He is enraged by it. He wants to have her killed. And while she's being drugged to the place where she's going to be burned, she produces the ring and the staff and says, this belongs to the father of my child. He discovers the plot. And he stops the execution and he says, she's more righteous than I am. Okay, so that's the story of Tamar. Now, according to Jewish law, they both had committed an offense that they should have been stoned. According to the law, they both did that. But they don't. They are not stoned. But she, as a Gentile woman, appears in the list here that we have of Matthew's genealogy. Another one is Rahab. You know what Rahab did. She was a Canaanite woman in Jericho, and she received the 2 spies that Joshua had sent in. She hid the spies, and because of that, she was saved. But she's contrasted in that story with a guy by the name of Achan. Remember Achan? When the city of Jericho was destroyed, what did he do? He went in and got some of the loot and hid it in his tent, completely violating the command that had been given, right? He hid under his tent, and finally it was discovered, and so his entire family was executed. They were stoned to death. So there's an interesting contrast that's made in that story between the Canaanite woman Rahab, whose family is saved by betraying her own people, versus Achan, who betrays his people and is stoned as a result. And of course, this is I think intentional to depict the contrast between these two individuals and these two families. And it's significant because it's communicating something. Here, who's the true Israelite? The person of God, the family of God in this contrast. You know the answer to that question. And then there's the story of Ruth, a Moabite. According to Deuteronomy 23, I believe, it says that no Moabites can enter into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Okay? Ruth is a Moabite. You know the story. Naomi, her husband, and 2 sons travel to Moab. And her sons marry Moabite women. Naomi's husband dies, the 2 sons die, and so all that's left is Naomi with her 2 daughters-in-law. Naomi decides she's going to go back to Israel. She's from Bethlehem. And Ruth, the one daughter-in-law, decides to go back with her, and she gives that famous declaration of faith, your people, my people, I will die with, and so on. She travels back. And you know the story. They're gleaning, they're poor people. They're gleaning from the fields, the field of Boaz. Naomi knows Boaz is a relative, a distant relative. And so Boaz goes to sleep one night, and Ruth sneaks in, and the text says she uncovers his feet, and she lays at his feet. And Boaz wakes up and sees her, and they have a conversation, a private conversation, and she says to him, you are my next of kin. And so what she's appealing to is the levirate marriage contract principle. And so Boaz marries Ruth, a Moabite woman, and she enters into the assembly of the Lord as a result. Why? The text tells us because of her testimony of faith. Now, why does Ruth uncover his feet? That puzzles some commentators. But I think the straightforward reading of the text gives us a good idea. I mean, it says that she uncovered his feet in the night. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a tall person. I have trouble finding a bed that fits me. When I go to hotels to stay, even in a king-size bed, when I'm stretched out, my feet tend to be at the very end of the bed. So what I have to do is I have to go around and untuck everything because my feet tend to hang over the edge of the bed, and when the covers are tucked in, it's very uncomfortable. I can't stand it, that tightness around my feet. But one of the things that can happen in a cooler room is that when your feet get uncovered, what happens? Your feet get cold, and you tend to wake up and cover them up again. I think this is what Ruth was doing. She intentionally uncovers his feet, so during the night, his feet will get cold, he'll awaken, and she can have a private conversation with him that's not in public. And that way she can make her declaration. So that's the story of Ruth. Now, Bathsheba's a different story altogether, because Bathsheba is married to a Hittite. Whether she's a Jew or not, there's some debate about that. But what does she do? Why does Matthew not want to mention her? Because what she did was intentional. Only the wealthy people, the kings, had rooftops that they could look over. And if you know anything about where they think the city of David is, it kind of rises up. It's very small, about 10 acres. It rises up in the king's palace. David's palace would have been up at the highest point. He had a roof, and you could go out up onto the roof, and you could look down and see into the courtyards and see into the areas of the houses below him. She knows this. What does she do? She goes out in the courtyard, and she intentionally takes a bath there, probably knowing what time he usually goes out on his rooftop. She is doing this on purpose, and she gets what she wants. He calls her in, she gets pregnant, and as a result, David, tries to do the cover-up thing. He gets her husband killed so he can take her as his wife. The child dies, but she does end up giving birth to Solomon, and that's why she's in here. That's why Solomon is in here. Now, why are these women in here? They're not very good women. In fact, you wouldn't want to put Gentile women in your genealogy if you were a Jew trying to preserve your pure Jewish lineage, right? But Matthew does it anyway, and he does it on purpose. What is it about these women that prompts him to put them in here? Well, first of all, they're women. That's the first thing we need to note. He does that on purpose. The second thing, they're Gentile women or connected to Gentiles. What did we read in the Great Commission? All nations. All nations. You see what Matthew's doing? It's setting up the theme for his book. He wants people to realize that it's been God's plan all along to bring in all nations, people from all nations as a part of his people. This is not just for Jews, not just a biological thing. It's not just for privileged people, but it's for people like this that we see in the stories of these women. It's not just for privileged, it's for everybody. So, a couple points to raise in conclusion. The gospel message, which is the message that tells us how we can be a part of the people of God, entrance into the grace of God, which is by faith, is open to men and women. It's fascinating that Jesus had women disciples. Typically, rabbis did not have women disciples. Jesus did. Now, you might be thinking, well, what about the 12? There's no way. No, there are other women that are mentioned in the text. These are his disciples as well. And he goes out of his way to talk to women. Remember the woman at the well in Samaria? The disciples were a little taken aback by that Jesus was talking to a woman, a Samaritan woman at that. But Jesus goes out of his way to talk to women. He includes them. Why? Because God includes them. He also includes not just Jews, but Gentiles as well. I've said this before in some of my Wednesday night teaching. It's interesting that when you look in the Old Testament and pay attention, it's amazing how many Canaanites are actually a part of the nation of Israel in sometimes prominent roles. Look at David's generals in his army. A lot of them are Canaanites, Hittites. The fact that Bathsheba's husband was in the army as a Hittite is significant, I think, as well. And of these women, they were not all pure. They were sinners. But yet they're included in this. And these women who are included also exhibited courage, boldness, and initiative in what they did, because they believed what they were doing was right. It was the only way they could get what they believed was right. And so they exhibited initiative in the process. So what Matthew wants us to see is that in the lineage of Christ, there are people like that. There are people who come from all kinds of backgrounds. Women are in there. Gentiles are in there. Sinners and saints are in there. This is what God wants. He wants the world to know that to become a part of his people, his church, it doesn't require that you come from a particular lineage. It requires that you simply humble yourself and put your trust in him, which is what is exhibited in the lives of these people. Rahab, look at her example. If she'd have been found out by the people in her town, what she had done, she'd have been killed. And her family would have been killed. But she puts her trust in Yahweh, and she helps the spies. And because of what she does, she is delivered and becomes a part not only of the people of God, but of the lineage of Jesus. Jesus' lineage is a royal lineage, even though it has these Gentile women in it. He still is in the place that he can rightfully claim to be the son of David, as a royal descendant of David. And so the message of the gospel that Matthew wants us to see in this is that the reason Jesus came was so that he could be the Savior of the world, of not just the Jews. It is to the Jew first, but also to the Greek, as Paul says, because that's the order in which the gospel went out. But nonetheless, it is for all nations. God is claiming a people from among the nations, not just the Jewish nation. And so the gospel is for everybody. And sometimes I hear people say, I'm not good enough. Sometimes I hear people say, God could never forgive me for all the things that I've done. Look at these examples. If God can bring them into his as a part of his people, if Matthew can include them into the lineage of Jesus, how in the world can you possibly say that God cannot accept you for what you are. He accepts everybody. And so if you are here this morning and you don't understand that, you should understand it now, that the gospel message is that Christ came into the world to die for sinners. There's a hymn that says, Jesus, what a friend for sinners. He is a friend of sinners when no one else will be. That's what God's message is in the gospel to us today.